Good evening, everybody. Sorry we started a few minutes early. We had a few anxious children who needed help with being busy. We are in the middle of our VBS, and we're coming to the end of our VBS. So thank you for being with us tonight. We have a lot of extra adults in the room. We're going to sing a few songs together, and then the kids are going to go back to class, and then Nate is going to be teaching an adult class here in the auditorium for everybody who is not between the ages of 3 and 12. That will be out here in the auditorium. Wise man. Anybody know the wise man who built his house upon a rock? Are you ready? Got your list out? Okay. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. Oh, the rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up, and the wise man's house stood firm. But the foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came tumbling down. Oh, the rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up, and the foolish man's house went. So, build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ, and the blessings will come down. Oh, the blessings will come down as the prayers go up. The blessings will come down as the prayers go up. The blessings will come down as the prayers go up. So believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and your house won't go. Got some good singers in here. All right, Arky Arky, back by popular request. The Lord said to Noah to build him an arky, arky. Lord said to Noah to build him an arky, arky. Build it out long. Go for barky, barky, children of the Lord. The animals, they came in by twosies, twosies. Animals, they came in by twosies, twosies. Elephants and kangaroosies, roosies, children of the Lord. It rained and poured for 40 days and nights and days. It rained and poured for 40 days and nights and days. It almost drove those animals crazy, crazy, children of the Lord. The sun came out and dried up the landy, landy. Sun came out and dried up the landy, landy. Everything was fine and dandy, dandy, children of the Lord. So rise and shine and give God the glory, glory. Rise and shine and give God the glory, glory. Rise and shine and give God the glory, glory, children of the Lord. Great. All right, we've been studying the Judges this week. We've got our Judges song that we learned. Othniel, Bush, and Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, Samuel. Begin. Othniel, Bush, and Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, Samuel. Okay, so you're going to be ready to do it with me. You're going to be ready to do it with me. My God is so great, so strong and so mighty, there's nothing my God cannot do. My God is so great, so strong and so mighty, there's nothing my God cannot do. The mountains are His, the rivers are His, the stars are His handiwork too. My God is so great, so strong and so mighty, there's nothing my God cannot do for you. Awesome. Really good. All right, we're ready to go to our Bible classes. We're going to sing our booster song. Booster, booster, be a booster. Don't be grouchy like a rooster. Booster, booster, be a booster. And boost our VBS. Good job. All right, 3 and 4-year-olds. Follow your teachers. All right, 5 and 6-year-olds, while you're walking, we're going to sing again, okay? So be singing loud. Booster, booster, be a booster. Don't be grouchy like a rooster. Booster, booster, be a booster. And boost our VBS. All right, 7 and 9-year-olds. There's a whole lot more of you. All right. Great class. 10 to 12-year-olds, you know where to go.
Yes, so it's handheld, so he's going to use it. You may just keep it muted. So. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. I was glad to hear one person there. That was you were all alone in the wilderness, brother. Then you had all these brothers join you, so now you're befriended. Oh, I'm sorry, Ethan. I don't have it turned on. Right.
So, okay, now he's got some power. Now he's got some power going. All right, so yes, our plans have, they're not normal this evening, but I am so glad to have a class this size. It's been a while. And this VBS affords us that opportunity where we can kind of all be together as a family, except for our little ones, and study together. So class will be made to participate, but don't feel like you are being forced to. You won't be, but if there's a question asked or a comment you'd like to make and you'd like to respond to that, feel free to do that, okay? So it's good to have everybody here tonight. Hope you had a good day and ready to go this evening and study a little bit. Samson's a pretty familiar story to most of us, to many of us, maybe not to all of us, To those of us who find him to be quite a familiar character in Scripture, I hope we'll bring out some things maybe you've not considered about his life this evening, even if it's something small, something that we can take and use and make application to in our life. So we're going to be looking at Judges beginning in chapter 13. I'd like for you to turn over there, Judges chapter 13 tonight, and we'll be looking at the character of Samson, one of the judges of God for Israel. And we'll begin by asking a question after prayer here in just a second. Brother Johnston is going to lead us in the prayer. Did my mic quit working? Okay. And that question is going to be this. What was a judge during this period of time of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament period? But before we do that, Brother Johnston, where are you? Okay, there he is. He's going to lead us in a word of prayer. Let's all bow together.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much, Lord, for giving us our life today. Thank you so much for always being there for us. Help us, Lord, to always rely on you and to put our trust in you. Lord, thank you so much for you sending Jesus to this earth to die for our sins, to give us a hope of heaven, to help us realize that the things in this world sometimes don't go as we plan. Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight and to be encouraged. Pray all these things in your name. Amen.
So Brother Johnston is we're co-teachers in the teen class, he and I, right now. And I said, you're still my co-teacher tonight. He said, really? What am I going to do? So put him to work. But so what was a judge? Hang on, you know what, Brother Ethan, I forgot. I've got some charts. If you could grab those there in the back and set that up, that'd be great. And I'll need a remote. I forgot to get that. So what is a judge? Anybody know? Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, you don't have to raise your hand. Just speak out. Okay, good. So he says the job of the judges seems to have changed between, for example, Moses, who actually heard the cases of the brethren and made decisions in the cases that were brought before him. And what we're looking at here in this time period, where it seems, with the exception of maybe Deborah, she seems to have done some of that under the tree there, but really they were judges. I'm just going to kind of concisely say what maybe you said there, Josh. They were judges in the sense that they brought judgment against the surrounding nations who were enemies of God. So they weren't judges for Israel in that sense of civil and criminal cases and things like that. They were judges for God against the enemies of God. And so that's why we see Samson, for example, being called a judge, even though he never heard a case that we're ever made aware of in the Scriptures. He's a judge in the sense that he's carrying out judgment. And so judges were, well, I've got a couple of charts there. There were 15 judges, if we have it counted correctly, in all. If I could get to here, there are 15 judges in all. 17 judges if you count the 2 judges that Samuel put into office. I don't know if we should consider them really like judges. I mean, what did they actually do? Not anything good at all. And it doesn't even seem that they were judges for very long. But if we counted them, maybe you come up with 17 or so. But Samson, if we number 15 of them, Samson is number 13. And of all the judges found in the book of Judges, all of the judges are found in the book of Judges except for Samuel and Eli. Those two are found in 1 Samuel. So our character is in response to VBS tonight, and it's neat that we all get to learn kind of on the same page this evening in all of our classes. So what did you think about when you first heard the story of Samuel? Well, maybe not the first time, but I mean like as a person here, a child, for example, growing up hearing about Samson, what were kind of some of the thoughts that went through your mind about this character? I recall seeing some pictures in Bibles and in Bible stories and things like that of Fabio, basically. He's this really good-looking He-Man, tall, dark, handsome. He's got flowing hair, and he pushes against these two pillars that are just at the beginning point of breaking. Kind of like the one that we were looking at right here. He's pushing against these until they're almost ready to snap, and then finally they collapse, and down goes the whole theater that they were in, or the whole structure that they were in. I remember as a child thinking about him as he's got to be the luckiest guy in the world. He has it all, doesn't he? He's as I said, the presentation I made of him was that he was handsome and he had this long flowing hair. His parents didn't make him cut his hair all the time. And he has the women that he wants. He gets to pick women even. He's well known. He's famous throughout not just his own land, but even the lands that were surrounding. And nothing stops him. He is really invincible as a judge. And as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that Samson is not such a lucky character in Scripture. In fact, there's no luck involved in his existence at all. He wasn't very strong, really, if you count spiritual strength as the truest of all strength, until the very end of his life, just before he dies. And the things that happen to him in life, as we can see from adult perspective, are not things any of us would want to go through. He was driven by his passions, unstoppable anger, frustrated by the things that happened to him in life. And we rarely see him ever turning to God for help. This is not the kind of life that I think is a good life anymore. In fact, I think it's a pretty miserable life, and I think that we can see in the life of Samson that truly he just didn't want to battle anymore toward the end of his days. He had had enough bloodshed, he'd had enough conquests, and he was finished. I find the story of Samson to be a very sad story of the use of a person's life. And if it had not been for the way that he was able to avenge for God, he was able to take judgment on the people one last time at the very end of his life, I do not think that we would read about him in Scripture other than in the text we're looking at this evening, and that would be it. He would not be listed in Hebrews chapter 11. And I may be misthinking some of that, but I'm giving you the sense in which my study has brought me this time around. He had flashes of strength on the outside, but on the inside, he was a slave to the basest part of humanity. He was a slave to passions and spiritual weakness. Trust in God was virtually not even there, it seems like, the majority of his time. Samson, perhaps more than any other judge, presents some really difficult questions for us about God and his relationship to these judges and the Israelite people. And maybe we can answer some of those things this evening to some degree, but our main objective tonight is to draw some conclusions from his life that can help us Because guys, listen, the thing about study of the scriptures is it's useless unless you do something with it. All that Samson knew about God was useless unless he acted properly on it. And so we have to think the same way. That's true for us in our lives as well. To be weak people who are made strong by God rather than being strong people who are made weak by God. And that happened in Samson's life. But we don't want it to happen in ours. Look there at chapter 13. I'm just going to briefly talk about what we see there in verses 1 through 25. It's the introduction to Samson, and it's talking about his birth. There is a typical statement just before that opens up the book that we see with regard to many of the judges. And that is, it's this idea, it's this statement, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them to the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Now think in terms of more than black and white on paper. How old were you 40 years ago? A lot of you weren't even alive. And some of us who were pretty young, and some were maybe middle-aged. But still, 40 years is a long time, isn't it? 40 years they are under the captivity or under the hand, under the might of the Philistine people. So who were the Philistine people? Philistine people were people who migrated at some point into Canaan. They were not people who were created as Canaanites. They came into Canaan. And I have an arrow here from the island of Crete. I'm drawing that from Genesis 10 or maybe Amos 9, but there's some places that seem to indicate maybe that's where they came from. But their presence in Canaan became so prominent by this time that the entire coastal land along the Mediterranean Sea there that we're looking at on that map was no longer called Canaan, it was called Philistia. I mean, that's pretty dominant, isn't it? Where you move in, you settle, and you become such a powerful people that it actually changes the name of the land that you moved into. It changed to their name instead of what it had been called previously. And so the Philistine people are this prominent people from the time of Abraham. You might remember, Abraham had dealings with the Philistines. What about those Philistines? Were they the same kind of people we're reading about here in the Judges? Anybody remember? Peaceful people back then. They had good dealings. Abraham had good dealings with the Philistines. But at some point, they turned to a different kind of people. They're no longer people who get along with the people of God, but they are people who are warriors, and they become valiant warriors, prolific warriors, and they stay this way all the time through the Judges. From this point of the Judges, from the time of Samson, who begins the war against the Philistines. That's his purpose, is to begin God's judgment on the Philistines, all the way till when? Anybody remember? Were they still around, for example, when Saul was king? Who killed Saul? Philistines did that. And his sons, by the way. Well, okay, Saul killed himself, but you know what I mean. They kill his sons, and Saul's going to be taken by them, and who knows what they're going to do to him. He falls on his sword. And it's only until David is the guy who finishes them off for all practical purposes. There's still a few of them around, I get it, but they're no power, that's for sure. And they pose no threat to the people of God. So you're looking at approximately a good part over 900 years that they reign and rule in this way and are an assault, a detriment, a danger to the Israelite people. It takes a long time to battle with these Philistines. And in 1 Chronicles 18, you can find that they are finally broken by David. Finally, he breaks them to the point they're no longer adversarial. Here in his story, we read an encounter between Samson and his parents and the angel of the Lord who announces Samson's birth and, by the way, his overall mission that he's going to take on. And so in Judges 13, verse 7, behold, she says, behold, the angel says, behold, speaking to Samson's mother, you shall conceive and bear a son. So then drink no wine or strong drink and eat nothing unclean, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. So what does that mean? What was a Nazarite? Now, before you answer that, because I want you to think on it for a second, I think you'll come up with some things you know about a Nazarite. Was a Nazarite a person who lived in Nazareth? So the pictures that you see with Jesus never having cut his hair, that you need to realize Jesus, we're never told, took a Nazarite vow. So it had to be there was something different. In fact, Nazareth is located in a completely different place than where Samson grew up. They're relatively together because the country's not that big, but I'm saying it was not the same area of Israel at all. Nazareth is located in the Galilean region in the northern part of Israel, and it looks like that today. I have been there. It is an Arab city. It is a Palestinian city. And I'm not sure why anybody would want to live in that place. It's clean. It's not clean. It isn't safe. The majority of people who live in Nazareth today are Arab Muslims. And Samson was not from Nazareth. He lived in a city, really not even a city. It was a village called Zoar, and it was of the tribe of Dan. And so there you can see the ruins of Zoar from the field, actually, where he set the foxes loose and burned up fields of grain as well as olive groves and everything else that the animals passed through. And so what we understand is a person who took a Nazarite vow was different from somebody who grew up in the realm or the city of Nazareth, like where Jesus was from. And so what was the Nazarite vow? What kind of things made up a Nazarite vow? Okay, hair was one of them. I'm going to see if I get these in order. Oh, they weren't all supposed to come in. So hair is one. You can see grapes is the other. Just a small side point, just in passing, but every time I read about Samson and his need to stay away from the fruit of the vine, we always hear it talked about as wine. He has to stay away from wine. That's not actually true. If I'm understanding this vow correctly, you stayed away from all things with grapes. You get no fruit salad if it has grapes in it. No Welch's grape juice. That is still fruit of the vine, isn't it? No wine, obviously. None of these things. Anything. No bread with grapes in it. No nothing. Now, let me say to you, of all the things that he had to stay away from, I got to say that's the hardest. I could go through life not cutting my hair. I think, especially since I don't have much of it, I really think I could do that. But staying away from grapes in Israel, what would that be compared to here? Like flour? Brisket, yeah. It's everywhere. It's in everything. It's one of their major things in Israel. Still is today. It was back then. That's a tough. These are not stupid little requirements that anybody would be okay keeping. Right? And especially, guys, this would be true if you were born into it and had no say-so. Right? Wouldn't that, as a teenager, wouldn't you kind of feel like, this is stinky? We always think, having hair like that would be something that everybody would want to do. No, most people don't go around with 40-year-old hair hanging off their head. Right? They just don't. We might think it's cool when we're young, but at some point we get older and we go, I hate this. This is hot. It gets in the way. I don't like having to comb it. It's all tangly, right? You ladies know that, right? I say most people don't. Ladies might do it. You know what it's like, but even you cut your hair, right? You get your hair done, right? And so I'm just thinking that some of these rules that are under the Nazarite vow, these were normally people who said, I'm going to do this for a period of time. We read about Paul doing that, right? John the Baptist was under the Nazirite vow. He took the Nazirite vow. Ever so often we'll read of somebody like that. This man was put under that vow by God without choice from the day that he came from his mother's womb to the day he died, is what the angel said. I don't know that we stop and think about how we would feel in that kind of a predicament. Maybe we would have a bit of a rebellious attitude about the way God put us here and did this with us. Is there a lesson to be learned? Are there things that you were born into that you have to live with for your rest of your life? Born that way and live with that the rest of your life. That you found you don't really appreciate all that much. I'm just saying to you, sometimes we may get to thinking that the way we act about things in a negative sense is justified. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. I wouldn't want this. Upset with God because he did it this way. He could have changed things, but he didn't. And I'm just kind of unhappy. And the only thing that comes to my mind in all of that is just simply to step back and say, everyone has been born with something that they're not happy about. I don't know of anybody who hasn't been. When you get right down to it, none of us are made perfect. Whether it is mentally or physically or emotionally, sometimes we even struggle with, because of those things, spiritually, right? We ought to be able to understand some of what Samson, how he thinks or why he does some of the things he does, why he is the kind of person he is, when we realize if you don't handle the things in life that you don't like in a godly way, it will eat you alive. And I think that's what's happening with Samson. I think he's been eaten alive by the fact that he's forced into some kind of a livelihood that he did not even ask for. Right? He didn't ask to be a judge. He didn't ask to be put under the vow. He's forced there. From the day he's born, he's being taught these things. He's being pushed into this. That's hard for us to consider when we get so much freedom of choice. He had no contact with anything unclean, or at least he was not to have any contact with anything unclean. Abstain from anything of the vine. And then what's the final thing? Don't touch. Oh, I said don't touch anything unclean, didn't I? Oh, the long hair. So that was the final thing. So those three things kind of constitute what a Nazirite vow is. And when we think about those, normally I think we don't think that those would be all that big of an inconvenience. Who really cares? Big deal. Well, it kind of was a big deal when you talk about living that way. So eventually he's going to violate, I think, all three of these. He definitely touches what is unclean more than once. He likely drinks wine at his wedding feast in chapter 14. It doesn't say that, but you kind of assume that. And he's allowed his hair to be shaved, or his head to be shaved. And so all three of those things he violates, but the biggest thing he violates is he gives up his occupation as a judge for a time. And I think that is what ultimately drives God from his life. So when we come to verse 25 of the text, Solomon is now a young man, and the text says the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mania Dan, and that's between Zoar and Eshtaol. And this is where his mission in life actually starts. It's a starting point of his mission in life. God is now has moved him, and he's going to use him, starting with the assault on the Philistines in chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. Let's look there together. Now we're jumping into chapter 14, 1 through 3. There's an occasion where he chooses his wife that God uses to judge the Philistines. So Samson went down to Timnah. So we see Timnah up there. All of this, most of this stuff happens right here, pretty close to itself. And in verse 2, he came up and he told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all the people, that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." So what do we see going on here in Samson's heart? Anybody have input? What's happening in this young man's brain? Okay, somebody says lust. I agree with that. I think that he is driven by passion here. He sees her. He says, that's the one I want. Good. Lust, anything else? Say a little bit louder. Okay, God's not where God should be in this whole equation. For one thing, who in their right mind goes and marries the enemy? These were literally enemies. I mean, literally, these are the people he's supposed to be carrying out God's judgment on. And he's marrying one of them. He's putting himself, I wrote down here, in an incompatible relationship. Let me ask you something. Is this relationship going to last? What's his job again? How's he doing that? Killing them. Right? He's not doing it well yet. He's going to do it pretty well in just a little bit. You start killing off cousins and nephews of your wife and watch how that turns out, right? It's not going to last. I mean, he's not using proper sense as a young man. I want to say to you, there are a lot of young men who are Christians that don't use proper sense and they marry the enemy. They don't need to do that. God can convert the enemy. I get it. And there are cases like that. I get it. But young people, let me just say to you, when you start looking for someone, you look for a friend of God. That person will help you get to where you need to go. If you don't do that, you're destined. You are absolutely destined to some degree to suffer.
You know, all through the Bible, over and over and over, they were told that the children of God were told, do not take foreign wine.
Yeah.
Do not take foreign wine.
Yeah, that's right.
Always cause.
Yeah, they were told over and over in Scripture, all the way back in Deuteronomy, do not marry the women of the land. Don't marry the foreign women. And there were lots of reasons for that. That's in Deuteronomy 7. So God's people should have a different value system than the world has. That makes it awfully difficult for us to marry someone who doesn't have those same values and us still hold to those values. That's hard. That's a lot of work. Yeah, can it be done? Yes, it can be done. That's true. It can. And there's lots of people in this auditorium converted by their spouse. God can change people, right? But I'm just saying to you that you need to know that before you tie the knot. And if they are not interested in that, break it off and find someone who cares about God. All right, so these two sets of different values are not going to be compatible with each other. They don't go together in some areas that are very important in life. And it'll make life more difficult and test your faith like nothing else could ever do. There's no one we're closer to in all the world, save God himself, than our mate. And God meant it to be that way. That's a natural repercussion from marriage. But it makes it hard when you don't agree on faith, the very fundamental platform for your life and mine. There's nothing greater than that. So Judges 14 verse 4, his father and mother did not know. This is a little caveat, right? They did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Let me ask you this question. Did Samson have a choice in his lust and his desire for passion with the enemy? Did he have a choice? Yeah, he did, didn't he? He had a choice. So, what reason does he give for his choice? Was it this idea God is seeking for an opportunity against Philistines? Samson said, well, God, Mom and Dad, I appreciate the fact that you're trying to guide me right. But here, God has in mind an opportunity against the Philistines. I don't really care for this woman this way. Just trying to work my way in, that's all. Just like a spy, get my way in, get my foot in the door. Was that his response? What's his response? I like what I see. She's right in my eyes. Get her for me. Get the arrangements made between your dad, her dad, and you, and make this happen. God will use, and what I draw from that is that God will use Samson's heart, just like he used other people's heart, good or bad. People who had good or bad heart. I think that in this sense, what is from the Lord is an opportunity against the Philistines to begin to free Israel from the rule of the Philistines. Not for Samson to go and marry this woman. That's not the part that's from the Lord. The part from the Lord is, I'm going to use this opportunity in order to help my people. If he's going to do this, if he's going this direction, if this is the choice, I'll use it for good. And in this sense, good being the freedom of a little bit more freedom for the Israelites. Judges 14, 5-7. Samson went down with his father and his mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion to pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Why? I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer for this. I'm just curious. Let's think to ourselves, why might he have hid that from his mom and dad? He didn't tell them that. Yeah. Okay, there could have been the matter of unclean. I mean, when you kill something, it's dead, and you're still touching it. Maybe that's kind of what I was thinking too, Zach. Maybe that's kind of part of it. Anything else you can think of? Here's one that I thought about. Maybe it was that his mother and father would say, what were you doing there in that place? Because what happens in verse 7? Look in verse 7. He went down, right after this, he went down and talked with the woman by himself. No companions, no mother or father. He goes to her. That's not proper in that day. And besides that, why is he going to talk to her? It's against his parents' wishes, isn't it? That he marry somebody that's not from the people. So they're not happy about it still. And maybe like you and me when we were growing up, we just didn't want to hear it from our parents about what we wanted to do, what we were going to do, regardless of whether or not they wanted us to, right? We just didn't want to hear it. Yeah. Okay. Says the lion was an unclean creature. Okay. Yeah, that could have. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that all could have been a part of it in the storyline as well. What he went down there to do, after all, was talk about spiritual things and God and all, right? Now, that's what he had in common with her, right? Wholesome and good things. So the text only says she was right or pleasing in Samson's eyes. Don't miss the fact that it's talking about his eyes, and they keep getting him in trouble. His eyes. It's always his eyes. When we combine looking or liking what we see that isn't good for us and wanting what we see when it isn't right for us, and then taking what we see when it isn't good for us, that is a recipe for disaster. And he's got all three going on. So verse 8, after some days he returned to her to take her. Notice Samson is acting on his own here, no mention of his father at this point, or his parents. It goes on to say, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. And he scraped it out with his hands, and he went on eating as he went, and he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. Again, the question, why do you think that would be? Eating honey was no problem, obviously, but touching a dead, unclean animal definitely would have been a problem for his parents. Again, yeah, say it again.
So that must bring some flavor, huh?
I wouldn't know, dude. Yeah, I don't know exactly what the timeline was here. Could have been pretty nasty, but it could have been also dried up. But still, he's touching what he shouldn't be touching is the point. There's another point here that I draw from all this. God has a plan and he has a purpose in our life, meaning that he has some boundaries, he has some principles for us to follow, which are good for us ultimately to consider and to keep. But when we constantly go against those things, things will not end well for us any more than they did for Samson. There's a timeless law that seems to appear through all of this, and that is things will never end right in the future by doing wrong things in the present. Such a simple thing, right? It's such a simple thing. I sure wish that I could remember that. This is the first recorded failure in young Samson's life. He is persisting in his desire to marry a woman that is of the enemies. He has chosen a path of doing what was right in his own eyes, verse 7, which becomes a description of the entire people in chapter 17, verse 9, again in chapter 21. And you remember, everybody does what's right in their own eyes, it tells us. It also is an indication of how things are going to end in the future. What do we know about sowing and reaping from Galatians 6? Anybody remember the core of that verse? Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Remember? For whatsoever man sows, that he will also reap. And verse 8 goes on to say, for the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, and the one that sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. A little bit of compromise will dig us in awfully deep. And we see that happening with Samson. He gets deeper and deeper as time goes on. So there's a time for this 7-day wedding wedding feast. Preparations are made in chapter 14, verse 10, to have this feast. His father went down to the woman. That's the last time we hear about all of that. Father and mother. Samson prepared a feast there, for so young men used to do. Still do in our day. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. 7-day feast. Is it striking to you that there are 30 Philistine companions and nowhere to be found are any of God's people around this man? In fact, that's consistent with his life. He is separated from the people of God. And even at his wedding, he's got the enemy as his companions rather than at least some people of God. Maybe one or two guys, right? Something. We need to know it's a problem when we think that we're being religious and we think that we're being who God wants us to be, but we continually limit ourselves being around God's people. Something's wrong when that happens. Something's wrong in Samson's life when that's happening as well, as we can see. And what would you conclude usually goes on at a pagan Philistine wedding party? What do you think's happening there? Anybody? I mean, don't get too graphic, but you think there's drinking going on? Huh? You're going to have to say, like, I'm half deaf. Okay, drinking. She says drinking, carousing. I mean, it's a party, right? And it's a worldly party. It's not like an Israelite party that would maybe be more wholesome, right? And so there's a party going on. That's where I think he probably partakes in wine. We're not told that, so we don't know that for sure. But it's here that Samson sees a way to arrogantly gain some possessions from some of these so-called friends of his. Look down in verse 12. Let me now put a riddle to you. If you could tell me what it is, they're all having a bunch of fun together. within 7 days of the feast, and find out, then I will give you 30 linen garments, 30 changes of clothes. If you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me the linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. An impossible riddle goes out. Something to eat, something of the eater, sorry, I can't even get that right. Out of the eater comes something to eat, and out of the strong comes something sweet. And of course, they don't have a clue what that is. Nobody would. It doesn't seem like, he's all alone when he does it. He doesn't tell his parents. So nobody's going to get that. 4 days go by, and they corner his wife in the middle of this wedding feast. Verse 15, on the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle, tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house. Now, that tells you the kind of people you're dealing with, right? This is who he wants to marry into. Then they accuse her of being the source of the problem. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? You bring us to the wedding feast, we're going to leave poor. It's your fault that we're here to begin with, I think is what they might have been thinking. Maybe they were more her friends than his, possibly. Never mind that they're the ones who actually accept the challenge, and they're like, bring it on, strong man. And he does, and they can't. So verse 17, she wept before him 7 days that their feast lasted, and on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people, and he is ticked off by that. It says in verse 18, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. I would suggest to you married guys, that is not the right way to speak about your wife. Especially, you might get away with it after 40 years of marriage, she just slap you down. But, especially as a newlywed, that's not going to go over too well. So he insults her, he insults them. He's gotten himself into this gut-wrenching problem because this was who he wanted to marry, regardless of what his parents said, regardless of what the law said, regardless about what wisdom taught him or should have taught him. Now he's in the problem, and his sinful passions have dug him into a hole. And now God uses another of Samson's passions to complete a greater mission. And that's found in chapter 14, verse 19. In anger, we look at here, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Eshkelon. That's a 23-mile away trek that you can see there. He's in Timnah, right? Right there. So he goes down to Eshkelon, 23 miles. He's frustrated. He's burning up in anger. He's mad about what's taken place and how he'd been duped. And it says he struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. Now stop and think about that a minute. There's people who won't even kill a dog with that kind of sense about them. He owes 30 garments. So what does he do? He kills 30 men, and takes their stuff. And then he goes back up to where he was, and he gives those garments to the people that he owed. That doesn't have much regard for human life, does it? That's a picture of a man who can be a cold-blooded killer without blinking. Person says, well, it was God's will. Yeah, it was. But we don't read of any other judges that thought of life this way. This is just ruthless. And it's for him. Has nothing to do with God. Has nothing to do with judgment on an unrighteous people, on an ungodly people. It just has to do with the fact that, he got duped in this riddle, and his wife ticked him off, and these guys ticked him off, and he goes, fine then. And he goes and kills 30 grown men. Steals, takes all their clothes, all their stuff. If they had money or whatever, that went too. Goes back and gives it to the guys that he owes. I'm just trying to strike in our mind the visualization out of and away from what we grew up thinking of how great it would be if we could have been like Samson. If we just had power like him. with power comes responsibility, and he is abusing the power God had given him. But at any rate, he takes the spoil and he gives the garments. In hot anger, he leaves his wife. He leaves Timnah. He goes back to his hometown, and he stays away apparently for a fairly decent amount of time. We don't know time frame exactly, I don't think, but it's long enough that verse 20 says Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. Man, oh man, if you'll kill 30 men for a few robes, what are you going to do when this happens? There is an escalation taking place that God absolutely knew was going to take place because of the kind of person he was dealing with, the heart of the kind of person he was dealing with. So God's going to use this to his advantage again. Chapter 15, verse 1, after some days at the time of wheat harvest, that's important to notice, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. Now, he's all ready to be a husband again. He's over it. I feel good again. I've dealt with it emotionally. Back into the game again. So he goes back to his wife that he's married to here, and he says, I will go into my wife in the chamber. So he's got something on his mind, right? But her father would not allow him to go to her. Why? Well, her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her. Why would he think that? Because he's been gone. That's why. He left, and he stayed gone for a period of time. And besides, she's the one who deceived him, and everybody knows now he didn't like that at all. So his father-in-law thinks, well, he's called it quits, and he says, I gave her to your companion. But as any good father-in-law would do, he says, but wait, her younger sister is even better looking than her, because everybody knows what drives Samson. But to Samson's credit, this isn't okay. And so his father says, please take her younger sister. Verse 3, Samson said to them, this time, which means before, he was maybe not justified, right? But this time, he feels justified. He says, I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. I just love this. He's like, this time they did it wrong and I'm in the right. And so Samson went and he caught 300 foxes. He took torches and he turned them tail to tail. He put the torch between the pair of their tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain. Remember, it's harvest time. What happens at harvest time? Everything's dry, right? Nothing's been being watered anymore. So it's harvest time. He lets them go into these fields that are dry and they've been harvesting. And he sets fire to the stacks of grain and to the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Tunamite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. You remember when they said, if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to burn you and your house, your father? Remember that? That happened. It happens right here. The Philistines come up and they burn her and her father with fire. So the very thing she set out to avoid happens to her. And Samson said to them, now it has truly escalated. If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you. After that, I will quit. And he struck them hip and thigh with great blow. And he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock at Edom. Again, God's judgment is carried out. But with this, there is an escalation, and they get the attention of the men of Israel by coming in and raiding Lehi. And so in chapter 15, verse 11, 3,000 men of Judah takes 3,000 men to come down to him, his own people. 3,000 men come down to the cleft of the rock and eat them. And they said to Samson, do you not know the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. That sounds like a pretty callous way of dealing with the problem. Well, they did it to me first. I just retaliated, that's all. And he's telling the truth in all that. And so he willingly lets 3,000 men bind him. They take him to Lehi. Judges 15, verse 14 now. When they came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax, and that has caught fire. And his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. Put out his hand, he took it, and with it he struck down 1,000 men. That is absolutely incredible. That kind of, just the stamina alone would be incredible to have. We talk about the little kids running around and go, if I could just bottle that up and drink it every day, that'd be great, wouldn't it? I mean, this far surpasses that. He kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, and once again, he's touching what is unclean. I don't think most people even notice that. The dead jawbone is an unclean item to touch. A dead donkey jawbone is unclean. So verse 16. So Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. So he's making up a poem. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have struck down 1,000 men. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand. But he's thirsty. After all this fighting, killing, touching what he's not supposed to, he's really thirsty. And in rare display, first time that we read of in his story, he calls on God. Verse 18, he called upon the Lord and said, you have granted this great victory of salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall to the hands of the uncircumcised? And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Verse 20, he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. Sounds like the end of the story, right? My suggestion to you is, it almost is the end of the story. In fact, I would say to you, with the exception of what we see when he dies, his job is done. We don't read of him killing one more Philistine. No more judgments on the Philistines. My suggestion to you is what I don't think I've ever heard anywhere else before, and so maybe I'm wrong. Anytime you hear something new, red flag ought to go up. So you might just consider it as you consider this. Seems to me that after Samson has done this deed of 1,000 dead people piled up, he said he feels, I'm done. Wouldn't you? Kill 1,000 men at one time. Wouldn't you feel like I'm done killing? This life that I've been leading, it's not led to anything good for me. He's been driven by his passion. He has done everything that there could be done against the will of God. He hasn't had God's concern in mind. He's not a judge because he's great at his job. He's a judge because God has made him be a judge. He's had relationships with people that he's been hurt by. He's made choices he shouldn't make. And he's killed 1,000 men, and he says, in my mind, this is an indication that as a judge, he's become now worthless. He has quit. And the reason I say that is because, as I said, we don't see him carrying out his duties anymore until after they have him in their custody. And that one final strike in faith. Well, he's still getting himself into compromising situations. We can learn that. In chapter 16, verse 1, Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute. He went into her, and the Gezites were told, Samson has come here. And they surrounded the place, and set an ambush for him at night at the gate of the city. He kept quiet, and they kept quiet until they kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till light in the morning, and we'll kill him." Verse 3, Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose, he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and 2 posts, and he pulled them up, bar and all. He put them on his shoulders, and he carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. That's a trek. I don't know that he went all the way to Hebron. There's a mountain range there. You can see it. But regardless, just pulling the city gates down would have been a feat. He not only pulls them up, but he carries them. If he went all the way to Hebron, you're talking about 40 miles about. That's a long way to carry gates with guard posts and everything else in them, right? This was not a small city. And the gates were not small gates. In fact, some of the research, gates of this period of time, early Iron Age, were elaborate complexes, at least 2 stories high, with guard rooms flanking a narrow opening. The 2 posts were set deep into the ground to support the doors. And the ancient route connecting Hebron to Gaza was some 40 miles away. What is the point of all of this? Well, he's getting himself into these compromising situations. He is continuing his fatal attraction for the wrong kind of women. Dagon, the chief deity of the city of Gaza, couldn't stop Samson from his assault in this way. I mean, when you pull up city gates, you're taking away a huge representation of the city, right? Fortitude. It's bigger than just taking out a piece of the wall, for example. He takes the gates. There's reason for that. More importantly, in this particular account, what is now missing? Does anybody see anything that's missing? What has Samson done every other time he's been upset? Every other time they've come to take him, to hurt him, every other time he's been trapped or in a place where bad stuff could happen to him, what has he done? He starts killing people. What's missing? Nobody's dead. Yeah. He pulls the gates up. He proves his point. But I believe Samson's done killing people, don't you? Why would you not kill the people who you know are waiting for you, surrounding you, ready to kill you? If you'll kill somebody for 30 garments, you will kill somebody for trying to kill you, right? He doesn't do that. And I think it's an important turning point in the account. And it's why we read what we do. He judged for Israel 20 years. In the middle of the story. Belongs at the end of the story, which it's there, but it doesn't belong in the middle of the story. It is significant that Samson only walks off with the gates. If he'd wanted to kill those who were laying in wait, he could have. And this is the first bloodless victory over the Philistines in Samson's life. He humiliates them, but he seems to show restraint, even avoidance of conflict this time. I just wonder if maybe he had not grown tired. It is a danger of every leader to grow tired, to decide to quit, to decide, I don't want to do this anymore. And especially when that leader has been someone caught up in inner turmoil and conflict and driven by his passions, his whole lifestyle, the mistakes, the anger, the stuff that describes the life of Samson. He is definitely no longer the Samson who doesn't mind killing people at the drop of a hat. So it's seeming turning point. It may be an explanation as to why the story is quickly coming to a close now. Because he has decided, not only does he not like the Nazirite vow, he doesn't like doing what God has brought him into the world to do. It is possible that his passion to judge against the enemies of God had just waned, subsided, only to be regained by faith at the very end. And maybe here he's at a point of his life where he's just ready to be done with it all. So Delilah steps into the scene. And there's another thing that we don't read prior to this. In 16 verse 4, after this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. Somebody show me where he loved anybody before this. Now he lusted people. Big difference between love and lust, isn't there? This woman he loved. And it's purposely saying that. In fact, the word love occurs only 3 times, or loved, in the book of Judges, and 2 of them are right here between him and this woman. He loved this woman, Delilah. It doesn't say he sees her and he says, she pleases me. It says he loved her. I think there's a big difference there that we can take note of. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her, I'm in verse 5, said to her, seduce him, and see where his great strengths lie, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. Is that really all they're planning to do? Is that really the truth on the matter? We want to bind him and just show him who's boss, that's all. And we will each give you, if you don't have that word underlined or highlighted, you need to. We will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. The average yearly wage, according to historians in that day, was 10 pieces of silver a year. This woman is going to be rich, beyond belief. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you. And what does Samson do? Anybody remember? Asking easy questions. What does Samson do? Yeah. So listen, guys, if you need to get up and get a drink, go to the bathroom, you know you can do that, right? I know it's a longer class than normal. It's like over an hour. So somebody was like, wish you'd have told me that to begin with. I'd have got up and left. But I understand if you need to get up and move around, that's all right. So yeah, he starts telling her false things, doesn't he? That's what you said, Chris? He says in verse 7, it's fresh bowstrings. If you do that, that'd be great. That'll stop me. But he snapped the bowstrings, we read in verse 9, as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. Then he says in verse 10, he tells Delilah, or in verse 9, whatever it is there, he tells Delilah, behold, she says, you've mocked me and you've told me lies. Please tell me. He says in verse 10, new ropes. It's all new ropes. He snaps the ropes off like they're thread in verse 12. If you weave 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight in the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. And that doesn't work. What's the significance about that last lie? He is closer to the truth, isn't he? He's gotten to his hair, the hair of his head. And this is so far probably the only of the vows that he's not yet broken. How can you say, look at chapter 16, verse 15. She says to him, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words, day after day, and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. My first thought to that is that a nagging woman can drive you crazy. But I'm not sure that's what's happening. What is vexing him? Words like that. How can you say you love me when you're not being honest in our relationship? He does love her. So you can see how that would make you be worn down to tell the truth. Verse 17, he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak, be like any other man. Verse 19, she made him sleep on her knees. She called the men who'd had and had them shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep, and he said, "I'll go out as other times and shake myself free." You notice that he doesn't say, "I'll go out and I'll kill him." He's still not in that mood. He's still not in that mindset. He's trying to settle down. And he woke from his sleep. He said, "I'll go off and I'll shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Is it just the hair that gave him his strength? What's happening, really? I mean, he's touched dead stuff. Strength didn't leave. Yeah, he just has continued to distance himself. He wants to be a Philistine. He had violated everything, and it seems that he just wanted to quit being a judge. He loved her more than everything else. And what we learn is that with God, he had the strength to kill 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. And without God, he didn't have enough strength to withstand the woman that he'd fallen in love with. So if we live like we are invincible because we are privileged and blessed and born into it by God as a person, and we make it a practice to devote ourselves to other things than God, one day, brothers and sisters, we can wake up and we can think things are the same with us and God, and they are not. That's possible. What we learn is this: Samson was as we are. He was absolutely nothing without God. God is the great, as the great psalmist has told us, God is our strength and our refuge, and there is no other like him. None. Not our mate, not our best friends, not even our brethren. No one is like him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, verse 21, the source of most of his problems. We made point of that early in the story. And they brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. He is lower than a slave at this point. This was not a job for human slaves. This was a job for beasts of burden. He was no better than the donkey. And here's where Samson really makes his mark of faith. Maybe we think up to this point Samson was really making a mark for God. No. Samson was making a mark for himself. Here, Samson makes a mark for God. And that's the reason he's recorded in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hands, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson that he may entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the young man who led him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars upon which the house rests, that I may lean against them." And boy, is he going to lean against them. Verse 27, now the house was full of men and women. Look at this. All the lords of the Philistines, from all over the whole country, were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women in addition to that, who looked down while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." In every event, Samson is driven by personal assaults against him. This one is no different. but the difference really, I say this one's no different. There is a difference. The difference with this one, this time, is that he is looking not through his physical eyes in his passions and his lust. He is looking through spiritual eyes of faith, and he sees God as a source of ultimate strength. And he sees his purpose clearly as he had never been seeing it before, and he uses that purpose to the glory of God. He strikes a blow to the Philistines that began their downfall to the days of David. He was put on this earth to begin the deliverance from the hand of the Philistines, Judges 13, verse 5. And in his boldness, he now sees, calling on God from faith, he can ask to be strengthened and complete the task that he was brought into the world to do. And it is therefore remembered by God, even in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 32. Verse 29, Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight into them, his right hand on one and his left on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his lifetime. You know, we can become our own worst enemy. Can I just go through some very quick points that I think we can learn from this? The problem is not that we are not blessed by God in our lives, but that we can sabotage what God gives us in our lives. Like Samson, we can be impulsive, we can be driven by lust, by pleasure, by anger. Galatians 5:16 teaches we'll either be led by the flesh or by the Spirit. And if it's by the flesh, we're going to die according to the flesh. But if it is by the Spirit, though we may die physically, we will live forever. Samson made the right choice at the end, didn't he? He was compromising. He broke God's commands when it suited him to do so. But that's no way to live, as he concluded at the end of his life. And it seemed that he got away at times with doing what he knew was wrong and what God would not be happy with. He was driven by this kind of stuff, the lusts, the passions, the anger in his life. Did he touch what was unclean? Did he drink or eat of grapes? Did he have his hair cut? He lived a life of disobedience to God. What if the harm, brothers and sisters, in this life is not so much about the rules, the actions themselves, the laws that we're meant to keep, as it is about compromising integrity? With each step, he was driving the presence of God out of his life. That was his real problem. Should he have obeyed what God wanted? Of course. We'd be foolish to say otherwise. What's the bigger problem? The bigger problem was not the law. We're not made for the law. The law is made for us. The biggest problem was his heart. That's where he missed it. That's where he was really struggling, was within himself. He compromised with his entertainment habits. He compromised with his purpose and his life for God. He compromised around every turn. Each of these things manifested themselves in the things we've read from his story. They resulted in his separation from God, removing God's blessings and presence from his life. That was the problem. We can see the application in our own life, can't we? Every action we take, every lie we make, every unwholesome image we view, we set before our eyes, every rejection of God's use of us as instruments born for Him. There is a God who is grieved by all of that. Not just because we're breaking law, but because we are breaking God's heart. The one who made us. And by His patience and mercy, He redeems us. Brothers and sisters, let us never take His power and His presence in our life for granted. Because when we do, we grow weak like Samson. Finally, never assume because God blesses you or uses you in a powerful way for his causes, that necessarily equates to our being right with him personally. People can go through life thinking because they're experiencing God's blessings in their life, God's okay with them the way they are. And that does not necessarily equate. Sometimes failure is our best friend, but only if we're willing to humble ourselves enough to realize the need for change. Sometimes being a spiritual leader means suppressing our desires for God's desires and exalting God's glory and not our own. Leading is not about doing what you want to do, but the power from God to do what he calls you and what you ought to do as a leader. Samson was proud. He assumed he'd never lose his strength. We can see how little he leans on God during his lifetime. Till the very end, it's easy for that to happen to us. We assume our past blessings guarantee our present success. And the easiest way for us to see if we have become that kind of person is to consider how little or how much we pray, we study, we commune with God. We only have 2 prayers recorded by this man. Nothing matters more than our recognition and dependence on God. And finally, Hebrews 11 verse 34 tells us it's out of weakness that we can become strong. And Samson is this glaring example of truth. No matter what happened, no matter where we have failed, no matter how we have faltered, no matter how we have sinned, it's never too late to reach out for God and to be somebody who works to God's glory to the end of our days. Appreciate all the good attention, guys. Appreciate the good comments as well.
This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Jesus loves me, yes I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. All right, so I've got some questions for all these really smart kids. We've got some Samson, it looks like. Some really cool artwork and crafts that y'all did. Okay, 2 and 3-year-olds. 3 and 4-year-olds. 3 and 4-year-olds, by the way. My friend Jace, biggest part. Where was Samson's strength? That is true. And how did we see it?